On today's episode of Locked On Wild, some national discussion regarding Marco Rossi and the possibility he still gets traded.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll take a look at some recent discussion regarding Marco Rossi, the potential that he still gets moved in the offseason. We'll also talk about Vinnie Hinestroza, who is surprisingly up near the top of the leaderboard in Minnesota Wild goals since he was acquired. We'll talk about whether or not he could potentially stick on this roster after this season. And we're just going to reinforce Bill Guerin's comments in regards to the trade deadline and whether or not we see the Minnesota Wild do anything and what it would take for them to even be able to do anything after the at the trade deadline. So a lot of just kind of reinforcing what we're going to see at the trade deadline here this year. My name is Seth Topual, host of Locked On Wild, and as you can hear, it's still in my system, but we're battling through it. It's just at this point a little bit of a cough that is lingering in the system. But other than that, feeling great, feeling a lot better, and just looking forward to being, well, not sick at all at some point here in the near future. That may not include what we are about to talk about because Marco Rossi has made a little bit of waves on the national stage here this week because, you know, there still are those national opinions out there that believe that Rossi is destined to be somewhere else by the time the season is done. We all know the financial situation the Minnesota Wild are in. They have a long-term commitment to Kirill Kaprizov that they're trying to get ironed out. Not a ton of money to be able to do that, in addition to a long-term deal with Marco Rossi. So wanted to just discuss this because there was an article that was written by Canucks Army, 7 top 6 centers with term the Canucks could trade for. And Marco Rossi was one of those players that was listed. And so let's read first from what we heard from David Pagnotta on the fourth period in regards to Rossi's potential availability. So here's what Pagnotta has to say. This may be something to keep tabs on in the offseason, as I'd be fairly surprised if a move occurred mid-season. But word around the league suggests the Minnesota Wild are still willing to listen on center Marco Rossi. And again, nothing is imminent, but as we reported last season, Wild GM Bill Guerin didn't hang up when teams asked about Rossi, and that still seems to be the case. But given how well the club's performing, there's no need to screw around with a good thing. Rossi is eligible to become a restricted free agent this summer. Elliot Friedman also had a little more on Rossi in the latest edition of his 32 Thoughts podcast. Here's what Friedman had to say. The one thing I kind of wonder about there is that there has been some rumblings about Rossi and what his long-term future would be there in obviously regards to Minnesota. But I think that kid has had a tremendous season. The thing to me is on a team where you have been battling all these injuries all the time, that kind of availability, playing every game, is not a small thing. So even if there was any question about where the future was for him, I can't imagine that's a thing that is going to be now. So glad that Friedman seemed to kind of tamper that down, because I'm in full agreement. I think based off of what has happened for the Minnesota Wild over the last couple of seasons, from even just a games perspective, like if we take it all the way from the start of the 2023 season to now, just to see kind of Marco Rossi is leading all Minnesota Wild players in games with 143. And in that same span, here is the numbers for Joel Eriksson Ek. He's played in a total of 119 games. So obviously Eriksson Ek is, we think the world of him. He battles, he's intense, he is physical, he plays just this great defensive style that is something that Minnesota Wild coaches rave about every time they get the chance. But he hasn't been immune to injuries over the last few seasons. And I don't know that it's necessarily being injury prone. I mean, if you want to say anything about the games that Joel Eriksson Ek has missed, it's been mostly due to broken bones, due to blocked shots, which I don't know. I don't know if that just says that, he doesn't have the best bones or what the deal is, but I don't think of that as a reoccurring injury. I think it's more so just that Eriksson Ek's style of play opens him up to injury far more frequently than it does for other players. But you look at that, and that is 24 games that separate those two. And in that same span, Rossi has 3 more goals. They're tied in assists, and he has 3 total points more than Joel Eriksson Ek does in that same span. And Eriksson Ek has taken over 100 more shots. So Eriksson Ek is still giving you a ton of good value when he's playing. But if you don't have a Marco Rossi in the lineup when Joel Eriksson Ek is also not in the lineup, you are very behind the 8 ball at the center position. Because beyond that, as we have seen with Joel Eriksson Ek out of the lineup, Freddie Gaudreau is basically your number 2 center at that point. So it is not a position that the Wild have a ton of depth at. So if you were looking to move from an area of depth to try to bring something else in, I would think you'd want to do that on defense. That is the area that I think the Wild have the most depth at. I would not subtract from the center room. Now, there have been these rumors and rumblings, or there were in the offseason, about potentially making a good old-fashioned hockey trade and bringing in a taller center in exchange for Marco Rossi, somebody like maybe a Dylan Cousins. I don't think that's something that teams are realistically looking to make, that sort of a trade, unless it's a player that they've soured on. And if it's a player that they've soured on, unless you think you can absolutely fix them and turn them into just the greatest version of themselves, you are taking on the lesser part of the deal there. So I would tend to lean towards keeping the guy who, yes, he's smaller stature, but you hardly notice that in his game. You hardly notice that in Marco Rossi's game. He plays every game, and I would just think that would be the player that you'd want to build around. And as far as contracts go, I mean, you've got a couple of good examples here locally to model after: Matt Boldy and Brock Faber. But also the one that I keep going back to is Matty Beniers. And that is kind of an interesting comp because the Wild are playing the Seattle Kraken as I record this. Beniers so far this season has 14 goals and 19 assists, 33 total points in 61 games. And if you look at what Marco Rossi has done, well, he's exceeded all of those by quite a bit. 21 goals, 30 assists in 61 games. So you tell me who's the better player between those two. So somewhere around, 7.5, I think is what ultimately gets it done. But I just feel like at this point it would be a mistake to look to trade a guy like Marco Rossi, considering what you have at the center position right now. And if you don't bring in a bona fide number one center in the trade, then you're cutting off fingers to try to give yourself, better standing with your other hands. It just doesn't make sense. So we'll keep an eye on it. I would be very angry and floored if Rossi's moved by the deadline. That makes zero sense. But this is going to be one of our big offseason talkers, to say the least, because it would behoove the Wild, I think, to get this done and not let it linger. But I guess we'll see. We'll switch our attention to a guy who was brought in during the season and who finds himself near the top of the leaderboard in the goals department since he was acquired. Vinnie Hinestroza. We'll talk about whether or not there is potential for him to stick around and what it means for the rest of the vets in the lineup. That's all on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they are packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. There is no better option than to go with one of your favorite flavors in the no shell variety. Because let's be honest, as much fun as it is to sit on the couch and crack the shells open yourself, it's way better when they do it for you. No shells, Wonderful Pistachios are amazingly easy and grab and go. You can just pick up a bag, take it with you to work when you're on the go, and enjoy a great snack. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. That's wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Wonderfulpistachios.com. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. We are your team each and every day as well. Seth Topual getting back into the swing of things here. And as you can see, I've still got a tickle in the throat, which makes it very tricky when you are a solo host to get through a show. So we're just taking requisite water breaks to do so until I get that crud out of my system. Just looking at the leaderboard here for the Minnesota Wild since February 1st, Vinnie Hinestroza, who scored tonight in the game that the Wild are playing against the Seattle Kraken as I record this, actually leads the Minnesota Wilders, tied for the lead with 4 goals. And I said this, I think, with Alex on Monday or yesterday. It's a little weird to me that a waiver wire pickup can come in and just immediately outproduce several fixtures in the lineup. Now, he's keeping pace with, obviously, Matt Boldy and Marco Rossi, who you expect to be leading the charge. But he's got more goals since he came into the lineup than Matt Zuccarello. He is, up until tonight, because Marcus Johansson with a multi-point effort, he had more goals than Marcus Johansson. He had more goals than the entirety of the fourth line. And I wonder to myself, I'm like, how is this possible? Well, I think the way in which Vinnie Hinestroza is getting his goals is very indicative of the kind of thing that I think a lot of the other players on this roster should take note of. It's no coincidence that Hinestroza found himself elevated onto the top power play, because he literally has just been going to the net and being the net front guy, getting deflections in front, and just really focusing on a simplified approach, very workmanlike approach, lunch pail approach to standing in and just doing what needs to be done. He's not afraid to shoot the puck, and he's not afraid to get his hands dirty. And I think we see this Minnesota Wild team default to trying to be too flashy when things aren't going well, when they're not playing north to south, so to speak. You see all the flash and the sizzle and none of the goals. So I think that's why Hinostroza has been such a revelation and has actually helped the power play since he hopped on the roster, is because he's not trying to do too much. He's just trying to be part of the process and trying to help this team win games, and just doing whatever is necessary, including those greasy, grimy goals. Now, would this mean that Hinostroza maybe stays on the roster after the season is over? Well, I think that would require the removal of any of the other players on the roster that we kind of question. I would have no problem with Hinostroza being in a role he's suited for, which again is a bottom six role. But that means that you're going to have to subtract from an already crowded bottom six. Now, maybe you find a way for him to be like a fourth line / depth type guy. Maybe he's amenable to that type of a role. In that case, go for it. But the point here that I'm trying to make is it's another bottom six player that is brought in to try to plug a hole that should be filled by a top six player. And this is, as of right now, this is the mark of the Bill Guerin tenure, is that all of this deficiency in the top six has been filled with players that are probably playing out of position. So if it were my choice, do you keep Vinnie Hinostroza, or do you try to find somebody to actually fill a needed hole? I would obviously say, well, let's actually go try to find and fill in the top six with somebody who's capable of that. But he's outperformed even some of the guys in the bottom six that maybe by keeping him, you can get a little bit of a change down there, fourth line especially. I don't know. It's something that will, I think, be worth a look in the offseason, but it's one of those that's going to be far down on the list, because I don't want it to come at the expense of any of the other major things that this team needs to address once again in the offseason. So a solid waiver pickup, but I'm kind of starting to wonder here. Declan Chisholm first, and now Vinnie Hinostroza, why those guys have come in and have looked better than some of the regulars in the lineup in a short amount of time. Like, if I'm Bill Guerin, I'm like, that's not great that he's outperforming those guys who I brought in to help this team out. So that's something that I think will need to be addressed in the offseason. Now, the trade deadline's Friday, but by all accounts, it's going to be a mostly quiet deadline for the Minnesota Wild. They did get Gustav Nyquist to help shore up the top six, but I don't think that's enough to I don't think that's enough to pull the Wild in the direction that they were looking to go, considering who all is out of the lineup and what is continuing to happen at the top of the Central Division. But we'll just take a look at some of the potential options that exist, considering the constraints and considering the protections. We'll run through what everybody has on their contracts as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Seth Topual with you as we get things back into regular roll here up to the trade deadline. A reminder, we're looking to do a live trade deadline breakdown show for you on Friday. So stay tuned for that. Just trying to work out all the details. So we'll give you more information about that here in the next couple of days. Just looking at kind of seeing what all happens at the deadline here. Feel like a lot of the trades already did occur, but who knows? Maybe Mikko Rantanen gets traded again, and then we'd have ourselves quite the crazy deadline. Speaking of, it feels as though it's going to be a quiet deadline for the Minnesota Wild. That is at least what everybody is discussing here this week, because there's no money. The Wild don't have a ton of available cap because they continue to insist that Kirill Kaprizov's coming back before the regular season is done. Joel Eriksson Ek potentially as well. Jonas Brodin, maybe. So they don't want to use that money because they want to be able to quickly reactivate Kirill Kaprizov from long-term injured reserve once he's ready to return. If you utilized his cap space, you would have a good chunk to be able to do pretty much whatever you wanted to help out this lineup. But that's neither here nor there. We talked about that at length yesterday as well. Bill Guerin did say, if there is a move made, it's going to pretty much have to be a hockey trade, a good old-fashioned hockey trade to make it work where there is pretty much equal money leaving as there is coming in. Well, it'd have to be more money leaving than there was coming in because the Wild just they can't afford to keep any on the books. So who has protection? Who doesn't? Well, some of the guys that are obviously not going anywhere. Matt Boldy does not technically have trade protection, but he's not going anywhere. Obviously, on the other end, Brock Faber does not, on his entry-level contract. His new deal kicks in next year. He doesn't have trade protection on that deal, at least early on. Zach Bogosian does not have trade protection. John Merrill does not have trade protection. Declan Chisholm does not have trade protection. Jake Middleton does not have trade protection this year. So there are players that technically don't on defense, which again, as I alluded to, position of strength. You obviously don't have Brodin in the lineup right now, but position of strength with depth. Because you've got David Jiricek, who is, I feel like, very close, if not ready, to be able to make an impact at the NHL level. So you got a little depth there that you could utilize to make something happen. On the offensive side, protections for particular players. Matt Zuccarello has a full no movement clause. Marcus Foligno, a full no movement clause. Ryan Hartman, a full no movement clause. Freddie Gaudreau is a 15-team no trade list. Marcus Johansson is a no trade clause. Jakob Lauko, Marco Rossi, Brendan Gaunce, Devin Shore, and Yakov Trenin all do not have trade protections. Now, the interesting one to me is Trenin. Obviously, that is a not ideal contract, $3.5 million for the next 3 seasons after this one for a guy who is a fourth liner and, doesn't have a ton in the way of goals this season. He has 6 goals in 55 games. So, he's not a big goal scorer in general. But here's the other part of this that's kind of a problem for teams that would potentially acquire that in. He has always been known as a penalty killer type. The Minnesota Wild penalty kill is abysmally bad this year. So are you really going to acquire a guy like that? That is one that I feel like the Wild would have to retain on the whole thing. If you are going to make a deal, make a trade of that contract to free up some money. So half of 3.5, is that really going to do anything for you to be able to make a deal? Unless you send them to Anaheim and you have them, take on another bad contract. They're plenty good at that. It doesn't feel like any of the guys with protections are even on the table at this point. So this comes back to Bill Guerin. It feels like it would be Bill Guerin who would have to make the move, have to initiate one of these players, asking them to waive, asking them to go somewhere, and none of these players have to oblige whatsoever. So if there is really going to be a true 1-for-1 hockey trade, it feels like there's going to need to be a third team involved to take some money off the books, so you don't have to retain. Because if you retain, there's really no point. So I hear all that, and I look at kind of how these trades would have to happen and what is available for the Minnesota Wild from a draft equity standpoint. Now, they have a second-round pick this upcoming draft. They have a first-round pick in 2026 and 2027, but no second-round picks in either of those two drafts. So as far as appealing draft capital, that is starting to dry up a little bit as well. So maybe it is a situation where the Wild just Gustav Nyquist was the best they could do because Nashville said, yeah, we'll retain. And I don't know. Beyond that, I will re-air my grievances. Like I said previously, it's one thing to wish and hope for Kirill or Joel Eriksson Ek to come back, but if they don't before the regular season is done, I, for one, am going to be pretty questionable as far as why wasn't the money utilized in a much better fashion for this season. Because, this Wild team, the framework is there. They just struggle really in the one area that you can't, which is staying healthy. So I guess we'll see. Don't be surprised if there are a flurry of moves made roster-wise. And if there are, like if Joel Eriksson Ek gets put on long-term injured reserve all of a sudden, maybe they do kind of muster up their forces to try to make a big acquisition here before the deadline. But there would be a lot of different things that would need to happen, and Bill Guerin just doesn't show no inclination that any of that is on the table. So I guess we'll wait and see. We'll see what happens before the deadline, right up to the deadline, and shortly thereafter. But that will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. We'll have a recap of the game that is currently in progress against the Seattle Kraken with some of John Hines' thoughts, as well as some of the key things that stood out from the game as well. Make sure to subscribe if you have not already so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.